Hi. As the disciples come to land after having been terrified by the windstorm that Jesus saved them from, it's understandable that perhaps they're just staying in the boat and not getting out to encounter this new place in the country of the Gerasenes. But Jesus gets out of the boat, and when he does, he encounters one of the most terrifying figures in all of the New Testament, a man chained and shackled and living in the tombs wearing no clothes, possessed by a demon. As we approach this story, we're going to be benefited by the recent scholarship of a number of people who've been reading it through post-colonial and similar lenses that highlight the apparent political nature of this that is obvious in the story, Legion being the name for the Roman army unit, but left out by older scholars who were either apolitical themselves or saw that engaging politics would take away from the quote-unquote theological or quote-unquote spiritual element of the story. But fortunately, more recent commentators are not bound by such artificial distinctions. And so I want to highlight two pieces today that give us great insight into the story. This first one you can see on the screen, Hijacked Humanity, a post-colonial reading of Luke 8:26-39 from 2015, from the pair Elizabeth Arnold, who you can see here, and Jim McConnell. And it's a wonderful piece highlighting the use of post-colonial theory to show how all the elements of it are present here, and we'll see that throughout. Another one here, which I thought was especially interesting, from Luis Menendez Acuña, and you see him here from Berkeley, Black Lives Matter and Gospel Hermeneutics, Political Life and Social Death in the Gospel of Luke. And the term social death he gets from Patterson, who uses that as a term to describe all kinds of people by groups who are oppressed and torn away from relationships. And as we'll see, the person possessed by a demon here is all by himself. Even the guards that the narrator tells us are there are not in the scene. It's only just Jesus and him. No disciples, no townspeople, no people from the countryside. So the image of social death brings up all the similar situations where empire or other situations of oppression push people to isolation and away from the kind of social lives that lead them to have supportive and thriving existences. And as we engage the post-colonial view, we'll also look at how Luke has changed his source in Mark, as we've been looking at throughout this section here. We'll look at it as we go, but just as we start, we note a couple of things that are different that will lead us to explore some of the details. Mark starts with, they came to the other side, which is to say Jesus and the disciples, of course, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when he stepped out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And then we get this long description of, especially long for Mark, of the horrible self-mutilating behavior of this person. And Luke leaves a lot of that out, but he highlights something else. They arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee, and that will be interesting as we'll see. And then he stepped on land, a man of the city who had demons, and that will make this person parallel to the woman of the city who anointed Jesus' feet in the house of Simon the Pharisee in Luke 7. In a surprising male and female pair, we'll see a number of ways that they're connected. So we'll be looking at that in detail. But before we do, I want to remind folks, if you didn't watch the last video, of how we're placing this passage right here within this larger section from 822 to 950. And I know this is way too small for you to see unless you have a gigantic TV-size living room screen. But the main thing I want you to see is the blue and the green thematic elements here. The blue being, who is Jesus, which ended the previous scene. Who is this then that he commands even the winds and the water and they obey him? And what is a disciple? And as we saw last time, the answer to the question, who is Jesus, is pronounced from the voice from the sky in the Transfiguration. This is my son, my chosen, listen to him. But there are a number of other places where the identity of Jesus comes up. Herod as well asks. But in our scene, Jesus asks the demon, who are you? And so it's going to go both ways, as we'll see. And the other thing about discipleship, what is a disciple, in the green parts will take place after the scene. But notice, not only is there no green in the scene, the disciples aren't mentioned in this scene at all. They were the last to speak at the end of the last scene, and they're not found here at all until 9:12. So it'll be a long time until we actually see the disciples in the story again. Another thing that's interesting to pay attention to before we get in the details is the sequence. Luke follows Mark more or less, but I want to show you here how it looks different if we look at the canonical story sequence, which is the way it is in your Bible or mine, and the chronological story So we'll look at here how the canonical story sequence on the left, how Luke has it, is different than if we rearrange it in the chronological story. So in the way Luke gets it, inherited from Mark, we see they arrive and there's a description of the man, but then we see that the man saw Jesus, fell down, and the narrator tells us that Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit, which has to take place in a different sequence than that. And then we hear more about the past, what had happened and who had seized him, and then we hear Jesus talk to him. So if we rearrange it into chronological sequence, we have the background, then we have him seeing Jesus and talking to Jesus, then we have Jesus asking him his name, and then commanding the unclean spirit to come out. So one of the interesting things to be looking at here is why would Luke, following Mark again, but he doesn't always follow Mark exactly, and he doesn't follow Mark completely here either, as we've already seen, allow this to be rearranged so there's a certain amount of interesting suspense and indirection in the story, and a very modern way of storytelling. And then also as we start, this is the first reference to a particular place since Capernaum in 7:1. They arrived at the country of the Gerasenes. So we have to look at a couple of things as we start here. The meaning of the word Korah here, which is translated in this place country, and who the Gerasenes are. So let's first look at the word Korah, and then we'll look more about the Gerasenes. So the word Korah in Luke, and I'm following just how the New RSV translates it here. If you're using a different translation, you may have a whole different sequence. But we'll start with the standard scholarly lexicon. The Louw-Nida lexicon offers 5 different meanings of the word Korah, and that's why we have to pay attention to exactly what the options are to know where this story is taking place. And so we see 5 basic options: land in contrast with sea, a region, but not necessarily constituting a unit of government administration. So not a capital place, or not like we think of as a country in the sense of a nation. Countryside, rural in contrast with a population center. A field, a land under cultivation, but we'll see Luke also uses another word for that. And the inhabitants of a region, which is really interesting, by analogy here, the people themselves are used the same word as the place itself. But I want to jump, before we look at those details, 2 other words that Luke uses to convey similar ideas. One is agro, for cultivated land. Obviously, we get agriculture from that. And we see that a number of times, including in our passage in 8:34, as well as perikoros, which is to say surrounding region or land or other things. Peri for meaning around. And we see that in our passage as well. 3 words there, but let's look briefly at how these words are just Korah is translated. So in our passage, we hear it as the country of the Gerasenes, but earlier associated with other named places, we see region, and then we see that also in Acts down here, the region of Phrygia and Galatia, just like the region of Iturea and Trachonitis up here. But we see it's also here the land of a man produced abundantly is plainly the element of the agricultural element. And in the story of the prodigal son, traveling to a distant country can't mean nation the way it would sound in English, but some other just region, different place. Similarly here in 1912. So what we have in our passage, the country of the Gerasenes, doesn't mean a nation, but perhaps a region or the field or something like that. But it has to mean more than field, because there's a cemetery in it and other things. So the most likely element here is a rural area in contrast to the population center. But that leads us to look at the map and see exactly where are we talking about. So they cross the sea here, and Gadara, which is the name of the place that Matthew uses, is over here. Gerasa, which is not on this map because actually it was a very small town at the time. We'll see how in the 2nd century after Luke's gospel, it was developed into a large Roman town, which now has archaeological ruins, but those don't help us because they weren't there until later. But the wider region here is known as the Decapolis, simply meaning 10 cities. And why does Luke not simply say they arrived in the region of the Decapolis? Why name Gerasa in particular? Decapolis is certainly a name known to his audience, and certainly it's the large area like Galilee and Samaria. Each have cities in them, and obviously is a network of 10 cities. So that's an interesting element. But when we look here at Google Maps of it today, and we see the town in the ancient world called Gerasa, now called Jerash, isn't really anywhere near the lake. And the question of the surrounding region then has to do with how far do we have to go to consider that the surrounding region. You can see from a couple of these pictures that I took here, looking out from the Sea of Galilee up into the hills on the other side, and the Decapolis is a little south of that, but you can see how the land goes uphill like that, which would highlight that the pigs can run down the hill into the lake. But in art, we don't quite see it that way. Often we see it as if the whole story is taking place by the lake, and that's something I wanted to highlight. So a few things about the place, and this is all taken from David Kennedy's book, Gerasa and the Decapolis. He's really the world's expert on this. He's been working on this archaeologically and otherwise for over 30 years, so we're fortunate to have this work. And these are all quotes from him except where they're not in quotes. And I won't read the whole thing, but I will post it, of course, to the webpage. But I want to highlight a few things so you can hear them now as we enter into the story. So, as I was just noting, the city began to develop under Hellenistic era after Alexander the Great. But what the Romans really began to do was establish roads. And one of the elements that's important for our purpose here is this quote where Kennedy is quoting Zanker to say the new roads would be a, quote, symbol of the conquest and organization of a newly won territory, unquote, striking off in a way that seemed to, quote, tame the irregularities of the natural landscape. In other words, the roads were an element of conquest. They both helped people get around, and nobody complained about that, but they also established Roman control, much like Thomas Jefferson and his surveying of the land and the establishment of paths that would lead the settlers across the Appalachians and into the west of the continent was establishing the new idea of American control of the land. Also important to our situation is how much the locals knew about Rome and what was going on. So as Kennedy notes, local elite literacy in all these places would give them knowledge of all the classical Greek and recent Roman writings, especially those in Greek. They certainly would not be likely to know Latin, but they would be literate in many of the Greek and Roman classics in Greek. In contrast to that, peasants and nomad literacy involved what was called Sephitic inscriptions, which to see a combination of graffiti and writing that is perhaps a subversive expression. It was often used to establish genealogical inscriptions back many generations, and perhaps that's like indigenous people in your country or in mine establishing something that says we were here first and for a lot longer than you are now. So there's a controversy in inscriptions here, if you will, between the elite's claim to the land and the indigenous claim to the land, and that ought to sound familiar into the colonial context that most of us inherit in the Western world. As far as the Roman legion, which of course are a factor in the story, it's very hard to estimate populations and localities, and Kennedy is very cautious in that. But he notes by the 2nd century, again a little after our time, there were 3 legions in Syria, and the question is, does our area include Syria? Nowadays it's Jordan, but the Roman province of Syria, and he notes that it actually changed connection to different provinces, sometimes Arabia, sometimes Palestine, and sometimes Syria. And that would affect who the governor was, but that's beyond the detail of what we need to know here. As far as tombstones, because we find that the man is among the tombs, only the elite were buried with tombstones. As he notes here, most people, and he's a little delicate about this, their disposal must have been more informal, almost certainly burned in a pile, as they were in Jerusalem and so many places where people couldn't afford a tombstone or land dedicated to their dead body. So as he notes here, the bodies of the dead were dumped in communal pits with minimal ceremony. Another aspect of what we need to pay attention to as Jesus arrives in the place is what it meant for people to arrive. And especially important was the arrival of the emperor, or the emperor's delegate, the governor, or the governor's delegate, the procurator. And so, as he notes here, the event would be recorded on coins as an expression of Roman beneficence in the patronage system. The aristocracy and the crowds would agree well beyond the city and provide a parade or a pageant to invite them in. Jesus is plainly not welcomed that way, but it's to highlight their understanding of the coming, the parousia, if you will, the Greek word that's often used theologically for Jesus' quote second coming. The parousia just simply means in the presence of, alongside. And so whether it's the emperor, the governor, or the procurator, this celebration of the parousia of the Roman Empire was something celebrated. And the route to get there was not from the lake and coming down, but from the Mediterranean, then from Caesarea, which you could see on my map that I showed you, and I'll show it again. The route ran to Scythopolis, from which one could travel to Bosra through Gadara or Gerasa. You can see from Caesarea back across there. So that leads us to go back to our story. And before we end into it, just a couple of artistic images that try to accomplish what is probably impossible to accomplish, to show the pathos and horror of this story. This first one from 1653 from Sebastian Bourdon, The Exorcism of the Gerasene Demoniac. And another one from the 19th century from William Brassey Hole, where at least you see the person naked. And that's a bold thing to portray him naked. You know, Jesus is crucified naked, but no art that I'm aware of would ever dare to show Jesus naked. But notice that both of these show this taking place by the shore. And as you can see from my Bible Atlas or from the Google Maps image, this is not taking place anywhere near a shore. That's why Kennedy calls this region a virtual island, with a desert to the east, with a river to the north and south, and the hilly range to the west. Not a total island, obviously not literally an island, but not totally isolated any more than islands are necessarily totally isolated, but really a separate little region, and it's very separate from the Sea of Galilee. So let's keep all that in mind as we enter into at least the first few verses of our story, and as we do, I'll be pointing out the differences between Luke and Mark. So they arrived, it says, and he stepped out on land. And the disciples are nowhere in the story. As I noted at the beginning, it would not be surprising if they were afraid and hung out in the boat. But what ends up being framed here is a one-on-one encounter. And if we were to see this as he stepped out on land as at least implicitly parallel to an imperial entourage stepping up on land, not only did people not greet the boat coming in, but nobody is there at all. We don't hear about anybody except the swineherds later in the story who finally tell the people and then they come out. It's as if they were afraid of whoever was coming. If it was the Romans coming, that would be one thing, but if it's somebody opposing the Romans, that would be something else. So in the very first verse, Luke adds this difference, as I noted, opposite, antipara, only here in the New Testament, and it could have a metaphorical implication. In addition to being geographically opposed to Galilee, it could mean opposite Galilee in the sense of opposition. And certainly all scholars understand this other side as Gentile country, not where Yahweh would be the God worshipped. And that's evident from the pigs that are being taken care of, which obviously would be unkosher. But one of the questions is, what forms of resistance would there be? Jesus will embody resistance, and the people are terrified. So as he stepped on the land, a man of the city. And this is plainly parallel to the woman of the city. When we looked at that passage, I had to highlight in great detail how recent scholars, feminists and otherwise, have noted that against the old sexist misunderstanding that woman of the city meant prostitute, she was simply a woman of the city. And certainly this man of the city is nothing is implied about the fact that he's from the city of anything about his occupation or his lifestyle. But what we see is the exact opposite. And so a man of the city would suggest somebody who's civilized, and yet he's the opposite of civilized. For a long time, he wore no clothes. He did not live in a house, but in the tombs. Elements that he's been banished out there by the demon. And obviously the fact that he'd be naked and not living in a house for a Roman would be the ultimate form of barbarian. Barbarians wore clothes, of course. Many of them were in the north where it was cold, but they often wore animal skins, whether that's leather or fur, and the Romans saw that as part of the barbarians, that covering themselves in animals was making them like animals. But this man doesn't even do that. He wears no clothes at all and lives in the tombs. And this is the first mention of tombs in Luke, but we're going to see it in the end. Of course, it'll be about Jesus' tomb. And so we can envision parallels there if we want, but that's not exactly what's an issue here, because plainly Jesus wasn't possessed by a demon. When he saw Jesus, and Mark saw him from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, which would be more fitting to greeting an imperial representative. But he falls down before him and shouted at the top of his voice. And one of the nice notes here from Menendez and Tuna here is the Gerasene man in the beginning has no logos, speech, only voice. There's a mistake in my note here, but I know what it said. Since Aristotle, logos is what differentiated animals from humans. So in addition to his being naked and not living in a house, the fact that he has no voice in the sense of logos, here shouting and here voice is phone, not logos, indicating he's bellowing like an animal, even if he's using words. And he does use words. He does what demons often do. He names Jesus. What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me. So we need to slow down and go back to some of this here. He fell down before him, which is, of course, normally a position of deference. But we do not see him deferring to Jesus, and the shout certainly is not. This is the demonic voice. We saw it earlier, and we'll see it at the cross when people shout about Jesus there. And so this question, what do you have to do with me, is exactly the question. And because we already know that he is Legion, readers don't know that yet, but I'm not going to pretend that twist isn't already known to us. He's Legion. We can hear it as the Roman army asking, what do you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God, have to do with us, the representatives of the will of the gods? So it's a divine confrontation here. And as our first source that we looked at notes, that highlights that really, although the Roman Empire is what's at issue here, ultimately it's Satan that's at issue. So politically it's the Roman Empire, but theologically it's Satan. And we'll see that we've already seen that back in Luke 4 when Jesus went out in the wilderness and the devil there said, I give you all the kingdoms of the world, that all the political power of the world belonged to the devil. And we'll see it later in the story as well, in Luke's story. So he asked this question, I beg you, do not torment me. We see begging a number of times, and do not torment here literally means torment or torture or otherwise physical distress. It's used in Revelation a number of times where we might expect it. But might it imply, as my notes suggest, the Roman legion to be tormented by an opponent? And that leads us to go back to the word met here. Hupentesin here, used in 1431, and I'll show you the passage there so we can see what this implies. What king going out to wage war against another king would not sit down first and consider, etc. So it's a warfare scene. It's certainly not hospitality. There's a different word that Luke uses regularly for welcoming people, and he'll say that when he sends the 12 out and later the 72 out, if people welcome you, then stay, and if they don't welcome you, shake the dust from your feet. This is not welcome. This is a confrontation between the representative of Satan and the representative of God. And so in this confrontation, we hear out of chronological order, Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out. And we saw last time other words for command. We saw that as he commanded the wind and the waves in the previous scene, and this is a different word for command. Notice that what was named as a demon is named here as an unclean spirit. Luke uses those interchangeably. And then finally, we get what the New RSV puts in parentheses because it's plainly out of order here, one of the keys to the story and the keys to the sense of being social death, both in the sense of Black Lives Matter and other oppressed groups now, but also in light of Luke Acts as in the bigger picture. For many times here, so it's not just once upon a time. This is an ongoing struggle. It had seized him, a word used only here, sunapakai, and elsewhere only in Acts. He was kept under guard, but where are the guards? There are no guards here. He's certainly not under guard here. And it says he broke the bonds, but there are no guards chasing him. Perhaps they're hiding as well. Bound with chains, and we see that that's a word used in Acts for Peter bound with chains and Paul bound with chains. Revelation as the devil bound in chains. And then shackles as well as only in the Mark and parallel. But he broke the bonds, and the word for bonds here, tedesma, used again in the context of imprisonment, but in Acts a number of times for Roman bonds. And so the ability of some scholars to not see the Roman connection with the story really requires closing their eyes to the evidence of the text. And broke the bonds and driven by the demon into the wilderness, which is not the same as into among the tombs, but perhaps that implies the desert area to the east, as you could see on the map earlier. But it's certainly away from civilization. And so we get to our verse here that we'll end with. Jesus then asked him, what is your name? The demons already know Jesus' name, and he asked their name, and he said, Legion, for many demons had entered him, which implies that the man is speaking about being possessed by the Roman army, which would be approximately 5,600 Roman soldiers. Obviously not 5,600 individuals, but possessed by the entire spirit of the Roman army. And this is the classic colonial situation. People who lose their voice, they lose their homes, their land is occupied, and they're afraid to speak up because of the occupying army. And it will take Jesus to give this man a voice, to clothe him, and to put him in his right mind. And we'll continue with that as the story unfolds next time. See you then. Bye-bye.